Norway stretches nearly 100 miles from its southernmost tip to the high Arctic, a distance roughly equal to driving from New York City to Kansas City. At its northern reaches, the sun disappears entirely, not for a weekend, not for a week, but for months at a time. In Tromsø, a city of roughly 75,000 peoples, sitting at 70 degrees north latitude, the sun does not rise from mid-November to mid-January. Two months of total polar night. No dawn, no dusk, no noon, nothing to mark the difference between morning and the middle of the night except a clock. By any conventional measure, that should be devastating. Human biology is hardwired to the rhythm of light. Our hormones, our mood, our sense of time itself, all of it calibrated to a sun that, here, simply does not show up. And yet, researchers studying the population of Tromsø found no measurable increase in psychological stress during polar night. Not a spike, not a surge. Nothing that the data would classify as a crisis, in a darkness that would break most of us within days. That anomaly deserves a pause. Because what it suggests is not that these people are somehow immune to darkness. It is that they have built an entirely different relationship with it. Go further north, past Tromsø up to Svalbard, 78 degrees north, the last inhabited outpost before the ice becomes absolute and something stranger emerges. The people there, living in conditions that make Tromsø feel temperate, by comparison, report an even stronger sense of positivity about winter than their neighbors to the south. The more extreme the darkness, the more deliberately these communities lean into it. Consider what that means, not as comfort or coping mechanism, but as a fundamental reorientation of human values. Svalbard tells you something else too, something the rest of the world tends to overlook until it stops you cold. The cemetery in Longyearbyen, the main settlement on Svalbard, stopped accepting the dead approximately 70 years ago because in the permafrost, bodies do not decompose. The cold simply refuses to let things end. Think about that. A land where even death cannot run its ordinary course, where the earth itself holds everything, giving nothing back. It is, on one hand, a logistical inconvenience, and on the other, one of the most arresting metaphors you will encounter in this film. This is a place that preserves, ruthlessly, indiscriminately, and completely. Back in the darkened streets of Tromsø, something small is happening in almost every window. A candle, a lamp, a circle of warm amber light pushed against the black. The Norwegians have a word for what that light creates: koseleg, a concept with no clean English translation. Something closer to the felt experience of warmth and closeness when the world outside is trying very hard to be hostile. It is not nostalgia, and it is not decoration. It is a social technology, refined over generations, for turning the season that should break you into the season that holds you together. And this is the turn in the story that changes everything. When the darkness stopped being something Norwegians fled from and became something they furnished. The question is no longer why they stayed. That part is almost answered. The deeper question, the one that reaches back through centuries of ice and stone, is what the land itself did to the people who refused to leave, and how that encounter, written into the bones of a civilization, still shapes everything about Norway today. Ice remembers everything. It holds the shape of every valley it carved, every shoreline it buried, every village it forced to move 3 miles inland or perish. Norway's landscape is not scenery, it is a record, written in stone and fjord and silence, of what winter does to a world when it has 10,000 years to work. And that record is still being written in the bodies, the language, and the social instincts of the people who chose to stay. Consider what it takes to read a landscape like this. Not with the eye, but with the kind of knowledge that can only be passed down through generations of getting it wrong and surviving anyway. The Sami people, who have shepherded reindeer across the Arctic for centuries, developed a vocabulary for snow that most languages cannot begin to approach. More than 300 distinct concepts, each one a precise diagnostic tool for reading conditions that could mean life or death within a single afternoon. This was not poetry. It was engineering. Cognitive engineering, built from necessity, refined across generations of reading a terrain that offered no second chances. Take one specific condition, a coarse, granular snow that forms through a process of kinetic transformation beneath the surface, what Sami herders call siangash. To an outsider, it looks like ordinary snow, undistinguished, unremarkable, just white. But to a herder, siangash signals something exact, that the ground beneath is open, workable, and that reindeer can dig through to forage without exhausting themselves. One word, one single word, contains the difference between a herd that eats and a herd that starves. And then there is the condition that every herder fears most: a rain event followed by hard freeze, locking the snow beneath a solid sheet of ice that no hoof can break. The Sami call it Bodneskarta, ground ice, and it is not merely a weather event. It is a catastrophe in a single syllable. Reindeer pressed against a surface they can smell food beneath but cannot reach, burning energy they cannot replace, dying on ground that looks perfectly safe from above. What does it mean that a culture had to invent a precise word for that exact catastrophe? It means the catastrophe was common enough to name. It means generations of people watched it happen, named it so they could warn each other faster, and built an entire cognitive framework around the grammar of ice. This is what Arctic winters do to the mind. They do not dull it, they sharpen it, forcing observation so granular that language itself evolves to keep pace. But the winter is shifting now, and that shift is quietly destabilizing everything built on centuries of pattern recognition. Rivers that once froze on a reliable schedule, routes that entire communities navigated with confidence, are now closing weeks later than they should. And herds of reindeer, following migration corridors, their ancestors, established long before any written record, are stepping onto ice that looks solid but no longer is. The drownings have begun. Mass drownings. Not an isolated animal, but entire portions of a herd lost to rivers that the body of ancestral knowledge assumed would hold. When the environment changes faster than the vocabulary can update, the accumulated wisdom of centuries becomes, in the cruelest way, a liability. Yet there is something else in this Sami relationship with winter that deserves attention, something that does not fit the story of pure hardship. Rime frost, that dense crystalline coating that descends on the trees of Finnmark in the deep cold, has a measurable effect on reindeer behavior, the animal's calm. Herders have long known this, reading the frost-coated birch as a signal that the herd will be easier to manage, quieter, more cooperative. The cold does not only threaten, sometimes, in its own severe grammar, it offers. The Norse and Sami understood this together. Medieval texts and archaeological evidence confirm what oral tradition has always maintained. These were not two peoples in opposition, but two peoples in transaction, trading, intermarrying, reading the same landscape from different but complementary angles of expertise. Winter did not divide them. Winter gave them a reason to find each other. This is the architecture of cold. Not a wall but a corridor, not a barrier but a shared condition that pulls people toward one another because the alternative is facing it alone. Think about what the darkness and the freeze actually demand of a community. You cannot hoard heat effectively. A fire shared warms more than a fire hoarded. You cannot survive a Norwegian winter on individual ingenuity alone. The margin is too thin, the risk too total. Cooperation was not a virtue the Arctic North happened to develop. It was a survival requirement so consistent, so non-negotiable, that across enough generations it stopped being a behavior and became a reflex. And somewhere in a Tromsø window, as the polar night settles in for its months-long residence, a single candle burns, not for anyone in particular, not as ceremony, just as habit. Habit that was once, a very long time ago, something more urgent than habit. It was signal. I am here, the fire is alive, you are not alone in this dark. Winter carved the terrain and winter carved the people, their perceptions, their language, their instinctive pull toward one another in the cold. So the question that follows is not how Norway survived the dark. It is what Norway built inside it. How did a civilization forged in scarcity and ice learn to extend trust to strangers and turn that trust into the most prosperous social contract on Earth? A single candle in a window, somewhere above the Arctic Circle, it sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. For centuries before electric light, before central heating, before any of the infrastructure we now take for granted, that flame was the difference between finding shelter and walking past it, between connection and isolation, between life and the dark. The candle said, I am here, the fire is alive, you are not alone in this. What's remarkable is what happened next. What Norwegians did with that simple signal over the long centuries of winter. How they took a survival tool and built something far more durable from it. Researchers who study what makes Nordic societies so unusually cohesive point to a concept that resists clean translation: coastline. We touched on it earlier as a kind of warmth, but that undersells it significantly. Coastline is not a feeling you have alone, and it is not decoration. Candles on a table, a fire in a hearth, bodies close together against the cold outside. It functions, scholars argue, as a language of connection, a recurring social ritual through which Norwegians actively renew their bonds with one another across the long months of darkness. Think about what that means structurally. A society that built a mechanism for sustaining trust. Not through legal contracts, not through commerce, but through the shared, deliberate act of gathering around a flame. And here is where the science gets genuinely surprising. Among all the factors researchers have examined to explain why Norway consistently ranks among the world's happiest, most functional societies, the single most powerful predictor is not wealth, not natural resources, not geography, it is social trust. The degree to which ordinary people believe that strangers, institutions, and their own government will act honestly on their behalf. That is a remarkable finding because trust, unlike oil reserves or arable land, is not given, it is built. The question worth sitting with is, built how and built from what? One strand of historical evidence points toward the Reformation, specifically toward the role of Lutheran parishes from the 16th century onward, which some scholars argue established an early framework of institutional integrity at the community level, creating the expectation that those in positions of authority could and should be held accountable. This remains a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion, but the pattern it points to is suggestive. A society that learned, early, to trust its local institutions was a society that could, over generations, extend that trust outward to the state, to strangers, to the broader civic fabric. And here, winter enters the equation again, not as backdrop, but as pressure. We know from the previous block that cooperation in the face of Arctic conditions stopped being optional. But cooperation and trust are not the same thing. Cooperation can be coerced by necessity, trust has to be chosen, and it has to be maintained. What the long Norwegian winter created was not just the incentive to cooperate. It created repeated, year after year, generation after generation opportunities for communities to practice trust, to rehearse it, to make it habitual. The data from 2020 shows a striking correlation. Regions of Norway, where formal education was most widespread in 1870, also showed the highest measures of institutional integrity more than a century later, in 2010. That is not a coincidence. That is a civilization compounding. The investment made in one winter, in literacy, in shared knowledge, in the capacity to participate, paid returns across 5 generations. And perhaps most telling of all, when researchers ask Norwegians what they actually want from their lives, the answer is not more wealth, not more comfort, not more security in the material sense. It is autonomy, the freedom to make meaningful choices about how they live. That is not the answer of a people who endured scarcity and want to escape it. It is the answer of a people who made peace with limits a very long time ago and found something larger on the other side. Winter is not generous. It never has been, but it is clarifying. When survival depends on what you share rather than what you hoard, a certain kind of accounting becomes unnecessary, and a certain kind of freedom becomes possible. The candle in the window at Tromsø was never just warmth, and it was never just a signal. It was a promise, renewed every night of every polar winter, that the people inside would be there when you knocked. From that promise, fragile, repeated, accumulated across centuries, an entire social architecture grew. Which raises the question that will carry us forward. If trust was the invisible foundation, what did Norwegians build on top of it? And how do you design a civilization in stone and steel and city planning, specifically for a world half made of darkness? Look at any building in the Norwegian Arctic long enough, and you start to notice something strange. It doesn't sit on the ground. The Svalbard Science Center stands on 390 steel columns, each one driven deep, each one holding the structure clear of the frozen earth beneath it. The engineers weren't being theatrical. They had a precise problem. A building that touches permafrost warms it, and permafrost that warms becomes mud. So the solution was not to fight the cold, it was to leave it undisturbed. That is a principle, not just a blueprint. And once you see it in a building, you start seeing it everywhere in Norwegian society. The exterior copper cladding of that same structure is engineered to remain workable at temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, not sealed against the cold, but designed to move with it, to flex rather than crack. There is a word engineers use: compliance. A structure survives not by being rigid, but by yielding just enough. Norway learned this long before it had engineers. But here is what changes when you understand that. You stop reading Norwegian architecture as a defense against winter, and you start reading it as a conversation with it. Think about what it takes to internalize that. Not one generation of architects deciding to try something new, but centuries of people rebuilding after failure, adjusting after loss, slowly arriving at a logic the cold itself seemed to approve. The darkness-shaped rooms, small, low-ceilinged, oriented inward, not because Norwegians lacked ambition, but because ambition in this climate meant warmth, not grandeur. Windows face south in the far north, every degree of winter sun caught and held. Streets in historic Norwegian towns were laid not for prestige but for shelter. Buildings clustered to break the wind, not to showcase a skyline. This is functional design in the deepest sense. The environment set every constraint, and the culture met every constraint without flinching. And then something happened that no city planner anticipated. The design logic of survival became the design logic of well-being. Recall that Longyearbyen stopped accepting its dead decades ago, the ground too frozen to allow burial. A fact that sounds like an ending, but consider what it actually reveals. This is a place where the earth holds everything in suspension, unchanged, preserved. A land that cannot bury its dead is a land that cannot forget. The cold here is not destruction, it is memory made permanent. And Norwegian civic life reflects that same instinct. You do not discard what endures. That instinct runs through policy as deliberately as it runs through architecture. The welfare state, universal health care, subsidized childcare, parental leave, measured in months rather than weeks. These are not idealistic gestures. They are cold weather logic applied to human society. When winter can kill the isolated, you build systems that make isolation impossible. When darkness can break the individual, you construct institutions that hold the community together. The social contract in Norway is, in this reading, an engineering solution. And like all good engineering solutions, it doesn't look like a solution, it looks inevitable. Here is the detail that should give the rest of the world pause. Norway consistently ranks among the highest in the world for institutional trust. Trust in government, in neighbors, in strangers. Researchers who study this note that such trust doesn't arise from optimism, it arises from shared stakes. When the winter is everyone's problem, the solution has to be everyone's project. The cold enforced a mathematics of mutual dependence, and over time that mathematics became a reflex, then a value, then, quietly, unremarkably, a civilization. Down in the fjords, something else is unfolding. Climate change is now dissolving more organic matter into those deep, still waters, darkening them, altering what survives at depth. Oxygen levels in some of the deepest basins have dropped sharply in less than a decade. The Norwegians are watching this with careful attention because their fjords now function as early systems for the whole planet. Changes that take centuries in open oceans play out here in years, compressed and legible. A civilization shaped by reading environmental signals is now, by necessity, one of the most sophisticated readers of environmental change. The skill set that kept them alive in the dark turns out to be exactly the skill set the modern world needs most. Floating above the permafrost, facing toward the winter light, building inward, not upward, trusting the neighbor because the storm leaves no other option. These are not the choices of a people who endured winter and survived it. These are the choices of a people who let winter think for them, and built from those thoughts something that outlasts any single season. And somewhere in that transformation, from shelter to institution, from cold weather reflex to social architecture, a question emerges that no building code can answer. If winter is what built this civilization, its rooms, its policies, its instinct for mutual care, then when did the Norwegian people stop running from it and start calling it home? There is a moment in every Norwegian winter when the cold stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like clarity. No one can mark that moment on a calendar, and no law was passed to make it so. But at some point, across generations of survival, of firekeeping, of learning to trust the stranger at the door because both of you needed to get through the night, something shifted. Winter stopped being the enemy Norway endured and became the identity Norway claimed. Consider what that claim looks like in practice, not in philosophy, but in sound and ice and music, carved from the very element that once threatened to silence everything. At Gilo, in the heart of the Norwegian mountains, musicians perform each winter on instruments sculpted entirely from pure ice, horns, drums, percussion, all of it drawn from frozen water, then played until it melts. The Ice Music Festival is not a novelty act, it is a statement. A civilization that once built fires to outlast the cold, now builds concert halls from it, coaxes melody from it, and invites the world to sit in the dark and listen. What does it mean when the instrument and the threat are made of the same thing? Far to the north, in Tromsø, the Sami Week centers on a reindeer race across the frozen harbor, a practice that fuses indigenous heritage, physical endurance, and spectacle into one unbroken tradition. The harbor ice that once dictated whether ships could resupply a settlement now becomes a stage. And the animals that once measured survival in the depth of winter now measure pride. These are not museums to hardship. They are celebrations of it, annual renewals of a compact between people and the season that forged them. But perhaps no single image captures the full arc of that transformation better than Rørosmartnen. Since 1854, the winter market at Røros has drawn traders arriving by horse-drawn sleigh, carrying wool and handcrafted silver through landscapes that would challenge any modern traveler. And it still does. The sleigh bells, the breath of horses in cold air, the wool stacked against a background of snow. These are not reenactments, they are continuities. A tradition nearly 2 centuries unbroken, passing through wars, through modernization, through the age of oil wealth, and still held in place, in winter, on purpose. That is a civilization choosing its own origin story year after year. And then there is Longyearbyen, 78 degrees north, where jazz plays at the end of the world. The Arctic Jazz Festival in Longyearbyen is the northernmost jazz event on Earth, a genre born in the warmth of New Orleans, performed in one of the coldest, darkest, most geographically remote human settlements on the planet. When a candle is lit that far north, in that darkness, in a room full of people who came because the music mattered enough to justify the journey, you are not looking at defiance, and you are not looking at spectacle. You are looking at what a civilization looks like when it has fully absorbed its own conditions. The flame is no longer a tool against the dark. It is the center of the room. This is where Norway's winter paradox resolves into something almost elegant. The harshest environment on the continent is the one most deliberately, most repeatedly, most joyfully inhabited, not in defiance of that harshness, but through it. And the world is now watching that and asking a question. Norway has been quietly answering for centuries. If winter built all of this, what might your own landscape, your own constraint, your own darkness be quietly building in you? Every civilization leaves a signature in its monuments, its myths, its borders drawn across contested ground. Norway's signature is harder to see because it wasn't carved into stone or written into conquest. It was pressed into the character of a people, slowly, relentlessly, over centuries of ice. Consider what Norway actually did with its wealth, not what it spent, but the principle behind how it was held. When oil revenues began flowing in earnest, Norway made a decision that most resource-rich nations never make. It declared that what lay beneath the seabed belonged not to a government, not to a corporation, but to every Norwegian alive and every Norwegian yet to be born. That sovereign wealth fund, now valued at roughly $1.5 trillion, is not a financial instrument. It is a philosophical statement. It says, no single generation consumes the inheritance of all the others. And here is what the rest of the world keeps missing. That logic didn't come from an economics textbook. It came from winter. For centuries, Norwegian communities understood one truth with visceral clarity. If you burn through your reserves before the thaw, you did not survive to see spring. Restraint was not virtue, it was arithmetic. The fund is that same arithmetic scaled to a nation. What's remarkable is not the wealth itself. It's that Norway chose to treat abundance with the same discipline it once applied to scarcity. Most societies, when the cold lifts, forget what the cold taught them. Norway didn't. And so a question opens here, one that doesn't resolve cleanly. If the harshest conditions are what produce this kind of long horizon thinking, what happens to societies that have never been forced to think past next season? What do you build when nothing ever demands that you build for the unborn? There is no comfortable answer. But Norway offers something rare, not a blueprint, but a proof of concept. A demonstration that a society can hold two things simultaneously: the memory of what it costs to survive, and the generosity that memory produces. The fjords still move, imperceptibly, as they always have. Those deep-carved walls of stone, measuring time in ways human institutions rarely manage. The same waters that once defined the outer edge of survival now carry a different kind of weight, registering, in their depths, the pace of a warming world that humanity is only beginning to reckon with. The ice that once threatened has become the measure, and in that shift, there is a warning that no government brief, no summit communique has yet rendered with the same quiet authority as the fjord itself. We began this film with a question about darkness, why anyone would choose to stay inside it, generation after generation, and call that place home. The answer, it turns out, is not simple, and it is not finished. Norway did not master winter. It entered into a relationship with it, one that demanded everything and, in return, forged something durable. Trust between strangers, obligation across time, the instinct to preserve rather than to consume. These are not Norwegian values by accident. They are Norwegian values by necessity, refined over so many seasons of cold that necessity and character became indistinguishable. Somewhere tonight, in a house along a fjord, a candle is burning. It is not keeping the dark out. It never was. It is keeping something in, a warmth that is social before it is physical. A covenant struck between people who learned that the only way through a Norwegian winter is together. That flame has burned, in one form or another, for as long as people have lived beneath these skies. And in its stillness, in the silence where the ice no longer speaks, the civilization it illuminates asks the one question it cannot answer for us. What would your own world look like? if you had learned to love what you cannot escape.